Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon, good evening for you all once again. And here we are for our fourth main class of the Crushing Made Simple mentorship. Time is flying by. Time is flying by. We have already covered 60% of the mentorship. I'm going to start today with our fourth week of content. And the topic of this week starts in the topic of how to retain information advantage. If you have been following the Poker Made Simple lives that I made before the mentorship, we talk a little bit about that in those lives. And we're going to start today with discussion of this topic. How are you guys doing? Everything all right? Have you guys been implementing the stuff we're learning together? Want to hear some feedback from you guys? How are you doing with the implementation of the things we're learning here? This is quite important as well. The execution part, right? I believe you guys should be able to see my screen. Right? People getting into the call. It's cool. I think we can begin. All right, let's begin. Alvaro says, man, the freedom I feel during the grind now is so great. Before, I was very tied to the models I had developed that were very limited. Today, I feel like I play more poker than before. Awesome. It's great feedback, man. Really happy to hear about that. And yeah, the idea is that with the more knowledge we have, the more creative we can be to use all the sources of information we have. So yeah, that's definitely sounds very good. All right, guys. So let's begin with today's topic: how to exploit and remain undetected. All right. So last week we talked about. Let me make sure my slides are correct here. Yeah. Okay. So last week we talked about how to maximally exploit our opponents, right? And this was the very immediate, the most obvious thing that followed immediately from the second week of content, where we exposed the gaps between humans and solvers, right? So we started the first week talking about balance strategies, and I gave you guys a framework for executing low exploitability strategies. Then the second week, we talked about how people are actually not performing nowhere near close GTO. So there's all these gaps between humans and solvers. And then last week, we started exploring how to maximally exploit those gaps, how to build strategies that make the most money out of those gaps. We saw that typically people are going to have two types of gaps, right? So there are frequency gaps and range composition gaps. And within the topic of frequency gaps, we saw these main four frequency mistakes, right? So the problem of overfolding, that is pretty much almost like omnipresent in every line of the game tree. Under raising as well, present almost all the nodes, both by regulars and recreationals, and then lack of small bets, lack of over bets. We saw that people do not have the appropriate frequencies when it comes to these different strategic options. And then when it comes to range composition, we saw that typically due to the imbalances and the mistakes in range construction, people are going to be typically, things not working. You're going to be typically over bluffing rivers. And this is going to be a product of how they are typically not able to control their frequencies with the bottom part of the range. So we saw all of that data, which was the first step in our methodology for building exploitative strategies. So it has always been my desire and my goal to have a very systematical process to develop strategies. I've always been a very data oriented person, and I did not want to have a intuitive process, although that can work for a lot of people. I wanted to have something very systematical that I could reproduce, and that allowed me not only to have great results myself, but to pass on this methodology for my students in my staking business, in my private coaching students, and all of that. And this process looks exactly like this 4-step process. First, we gather data, then we analyze and compare that data, GTO in humans. Then we use that data that we found and those gaps that we found to calculate counter strategies, and then we execute. And last week, we saw the third step into this process, which is to calculate those counter strategies. And we use node locking, a function of PO solver, to build these models and then calculate what's the appropriate response against population. Right? So that's what we saw so far. We saw, for example, that in a big blind versus button spot faced with the back check bet line, humans are massively overfolding relative to solver, some nasty deviations there. And by using this information, we're able to build models that showed us, for example, that on a board like this, King 7 Deuce 9-3, we get to exploit quite heavily the population, right? We get to basically bet any unpaired hand, and we're even turning a hand like Ace Queen off here, which has 33% equity. We're turning it into a bluff because it makes more money bluffing than it does by checking back. So we saw this in a very simple river model, but it's always when you're starting out with models, the best way to start is on river, where it's typically the easiest to do. But then we saw that that's not the only thing we can do, right? We can go a bit further than that, because by the time we realize that people are going to be leaking in this future river node, then we can bring this information to the prior streets. And I try to make you guys visualize this by thinking of the game exactly as in a tree diagram, where each of decision is a node in this tree, and then each node has children nodes. And very often what we have is, for example, in a turn node, you have a certain hand that is indifferent between two options. And that's because the children nodes of those two nodes they sum up to the same amount of money. But then if you can expect one of those nodes to make you more money than before, then all of a sudden the parent node is making more money, and you should take that parent node way more often with your strategy to maximize your EV, of course. So we saw an example where I built a model where the adaptation player was overfolding the river by 4% in a 3-bet pot. This was a model for a 3-bet pot, button versus hijack. And then the adaptation player was folding to the triple barrel 4% more often than GTO. And we saw the GTO strategy shifting from a 60% bet, 40% check at equilibrium to something very exploitative, 94% bet on the turn, only 6% check. Right? So this is what we saw so far. This is what we covered so far in the mentorship, the process of gathering the information, then building models to calculate counter strategies. And then, of course, you're going to want to execute those counter strategies to eventually make more money, right? That's what the goal is here, is to maximize REV against our opponents, okay? But what is the problem about max exploit strategies? A problem that a lot of you guys have already raised your concerns with some questions on Discord. A lot of guys already also as well in the Poker Made Simple week when I covered this topic. What is the problem of max exploit strategies? Who can tell me? What is the problem? Max exploitable, getting counter exploited. We are exploitable too. Exactly, right? So it would be amazing if we could play this super highly profitable strategy and we could just turn our brains off and never think about anything again. Just print money like a print money machine that just keeps running indefinitely. In fact, there are some cases where this is actually possible, particularly anonymous games. But there are consequences to playing this very highly exploitable style, right? So the idea of max exploit strategies that we need to take into account when building our own strategies is that they reveal information. Okay. So this process of exploiting someone, what you're doing is you're leveraging the information advantage you gained from knowing that they have these leaks. So you found out about their leaks, you saw how they are exploitable relative to solver, and then you're like, okay, I'm gonna take advantage of this to make more money. So you're leveraging the fact that you have gained this information advantage. But in the very process of leveraging this information advantage, you're also revealing information about your own strategy. So you're making yourself vulnerable. Okay. And this is something that is impossible to avoid. It is a principle of how the game constructs itself. If you want to go ahead and attack your opponents because you can see that they have leaks, then you're putting yourself out there in the open and you're making yourself vulnerable to facing a counterattack. Okay. It's not necessarily to say that you will face this counterattack, but you are putting yourself out there and making yourself vulnerable to the potential of getting those counterattacks. And unfortunately, it gets even worse because when we study exploitative strategies, I call this the exploitation paradox. It's not really a paradox, but it looks cooler and sounds cooler when you call it that way, which is the fact that the amount of money you can make by exploiting is always lower than the amount you can lose by getting countered. And it's a process that is not very forgiving in that sense, because you could be out there and you could be making this money exploiting your opponents. But the very moment that they decide to counter you, you're actually going to lose more money than you were actually gaining by exploiting them in the first place. So it's not very forgiving. You cannot afford to get countered too often before you lose all the money you have gained. So you can think about it in terms of a pot odds problem. Like you're making all this money and it's a good amount of money, but then if you just get countered a little bit, because you're just going to be losing way more than you initially gained, then you can't afford losing all that much. You can't afford getting countered all that much before you just waste all the money you made. Okay, so that's a problem. That's something we have to address with the process of building our exploitative strategy. We saw, for example, I showed this in the Poker Made Simple week. I believe I showed it here in the mentorship as well. A very nice example that I always like to give, which is the delayed c-bet example. And I wanted to use this example to illustrate because the numbers are quite significant here. So it's a delayed c-bet spot, button versus big blind. And we have this ace 5-3 board. And when you look at solver, you see like this 36% folding frequency versus small delayed c-bet. That's how solver plays. That's the unexploitable frequency facing a small delayed c-bet on this board. And then you take a look at data and you see, Jesus, regulars are folding 53%. They're folding 54, but in the model, I wasn't even able to get to 54 without forcing OP to fold some really outrageous hands. So people are folding 54. Here we have the model 53%. And this allows the model to go from the GTO execution, which is this, 42% delay c-bet with the small size, to this. So this, which is the max exploit counter here for the turn node, we're delay c-betting like 66.5%. Mostly all of the airs betting and then checking a little bit of pairs and some king highs. And in this spot, you can see exactly this exploitation paradox of getting countered for so much more than you actually make. If we take a look at the EVs of the different possible strategies here, we see that in GTO land, and this is the EV in the root node, okay? Not on the turn, this is the EV on the root node of the tree. GTO for the FP player makes 296 big blinds per 100 hands. And then if you can apply the max counter, which is to check back a bunch of air and then start just always betting with your air in the delay c-bet line, you make an excess of 13.8 big blinds per 100, which is quite nice. But then if you allow the opposition player to adjust and max counter your own adjustment, then you're losing 52.2 relative to GTO, which is quite sick, right? So this is what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with some very profitable exploitative strategies because people do have leaks. We just have to account for the fact that if eventually it it blows out, we fail with our execution and somehow our opponents catch up on what we're doing and they apply the full counter, then we could be into significant trouble because you see, like it's a 4-to-1 ratio, right? So you only need to get a counter less than four times less than you succeed to lose all the money you made, right? So it's not something very forgiving. We have to account for the possibility that this will happen. It's not that this necessarily will happen, but we need to account for the possibility that this will happen. Okay. Now, I don't like to be so theoretical about these things. I've talked about this a little bit in the Discord because sometimes it can feel like this is all a theoretical discussion and we never get to practice. We never get to reality. So I want in this class to give you guys also some real examples, real results of real people that have applied these types of highly exploitative strategies. And you can find many examples out there, okay? And if you study enough people, you will find examples of people that have tried this extensively. But I wanted to give you guys an idea of what can happen in real life if you decide to do things like this. Okay, so I want to give you guys two examples of two players I have played against in my life, people that I have studied in the past, people that I have battled against, and that show different things that can happen when you approach the game from these perspectives, okay? So I'm going to start with one player that I played a lot against this player. I'm obviously not going to disclose the screen names or the names of these people, okay, guys? But these are real people I have played against in mid stakes and high stakes. And this first player is a player I played against in mid and high stakes on PokerStars. Mostly 500 Zoom. I played against this person from 2019, 2021. That's where we mostly played against each other. And this is a guy that would display stats like this. So take a look at this guy's stats. We see initially that glowing 53 1-soft flop there. Really high 1-soft flop for this guy. One of the highest I've ever seen over a large sample for regulars. I think I've seen maybe one or two regulars with higher than this, but it's got to be at like top 0.01% of aggressive regulars I've played against. And then we see like super high aggression frequency numbers, right? So 52 aggression frequency on the flop, 38 aggression frequency on the turn, and 36 aggression frequency on the river. Now, when you see this 38 aggression frequency on the turn, this is already above the normal level. This is already significantly above the average level, and it's even above the GTO level. But when you account for the fact that he has 52 on the flop, which is extremely aggressive, and then he still sustains that with 38 on the turn, you get a sense of how aggressive this guy was playing, right? And then we see 34 went to showdown, getting showdown quite frequently in a very low 41 wanted showdown stat. Yes. Leroy asked a question. Isn't the max display approach more applicable for multiple street aggression and or with big bets on the river, as our opponents will not get lots of showdowns, so they will counter less easily? We'll talk about exactly what you're asking, my friend, in this class. So hold on a little bit with that thought, because we're going to cover exactly what you're talking about. So this player, you can see, extremely aggressive. And then if you take a look at his folding and raising frequencies, it gets even sicker. Like I have here a comparison of this regular in the top. I call him hyper aggro reg. And then the stats of the average reg in my database. So this is for my own personal database. So I played mostly 500 and above in this database. And you can see an average reg in the bottom, this hyper aggro reg in the top. So take a look at that 36% raise flop IP in small pots. And we're talking about poker stars here, okay, guys? Mostly poker stars that we played against each other. So this is a known pool with HUDs. So he was playing 36% raise IP in small pots, whereas the average reg's 13%. The average reg even slightly under raising relative to solver. Solver is about 14, 15. So he's 36% on the flop IP, then 24% in the flop IP in large pots. So really raising a lot in big pots as well, both OP and IP. You have also turn raising frequencies much higher than the average reg, and the folding frequencies, right? Like the folding frequencies are really low. So 18% in the flop IP, 26 on the turn, 37 on the river, much lower than the average player. He was also playing this very funny. I remember when I first saw this in my HUD, because again, we were playing Poker Stars, so we had access to HUDs and we were playing a lot against each other, so I could build samples on him relatively fast. And he was playing this crazy strategy when he was the IP as the caller. So take a look at that. He basically had no folding range facing a small size, and he would just take all of the folding hands and put into the raising range. So he was like, okay, you want to bet small? I'm going to take all the folding hands and I'm just going to raise you. So he had 41% raise versus small C bet, BVB, and then 40% raise versus small C bet in 3-bet pots IP. So you would bet small against this guy, you were guaranteed to get raised 40% of the time. And then he was also playing very aggressively with his probe strategies and the late C bet strategies overall. Here we have his probe frequency, 51% as the out of position caller, and then 78% the late C bet in 3-bet pot out of position as PFR. So safe to say this player was extremely aggressive, and he was really trying out the style. He tried it for a significant amount of time, I would say. I guess I can't even say that he tried it because it was his style for a long time before that. So this was just how he played, how he liked to play. And unfortunately for him, in that sample that he played in those stakes, mid stakes plus, he was not very successful. You can see a super winning red line, but almost 60 buy-ins losing in EV. I don't think this is, of course, a description of his actual win rate, but it's safe to say that it didn't work quite well for him this particular period where we played against each other very often. I put it in the disclaimer here. Like, I don't think these losses are entirely due to his exploits going wrong, but the strategy was not working out very well for him in this situation. Now, what I want to talk about this when it comes to max exploit strategies is that the truth of the matter is that it is very easy to overdo it, and it's very easy to justify any spew with a population leak. Okay, so we need to talk about this because when it comes to deciding how you're going to approach our execution, if you take everything literally and if you, let's say, are not very cautious with your process of developing strategies, you can end up justifying pretty much any single play simply because you can point to a stat that says that people overfold and underraise and they do this and they do that. So it can essentially justify any play. Okay, so it's not so much that I think his style was particularly bad. It's just that he very likely was making many mistakes that couldn't be justified with data, but because he was overdoing it or because he was simply spewing without necessarily having the data to back it up. So this is actually one of the most difficult things about playing very highly exploitative strategies. You need to have an idea of what it is that you should draw the line or the threshold for stopping. And this is a problem that I've had in my career personally. The first times I started, for example, bluff catching rivers, I didn't have much experience. I didn't have much, maturity to make those wide call downs. And I would start calling down the most stupid spots, like calling down 4-bet pots where I didn't even have the data to back it up. But because I was calling down in all of these other spots, then I would assume that I should be calling in those very tight range spots as well. So I was making tons of mistakes. And I've seen that happening with a bunch of my students as well, where they would just get a little bit too simplistic with their approach and then start being overly aggressive in situations that are not necessarily justified. So a significant problem with max exploit strategies is that if you don't pay attention, if you're not consistent with your studies, and if you don't have a methodological process, you can essentially justify any play with a population leak. And before you can see, you're just spewing at the tables while thinking that you're playing the correct strategies. Okay, so this is the first thing that I would like to show you guys here. It's not because the data is showing you all those leaks that automatically you're going to become the biggest crusher with the sickest red line in the world, because it still requires that you have a process for these executions. It still requires that you have maturity to understand when to pull the trigger and when not to. Okay. But I also don't want to be discouraging to you guys here, because while some people perhaps cannot do it properly, or maybe they do it properly very often, but then they overdo it in some spots, which just kills their win rate, other people can in fact achieve a lot of success with the style. Okay, so I'm going to show you a different example. And this comes from a high stakes regular that produced this graph in 2022. Okay, so you can see here on this graph, he won $500,000 with almost 10 big blinds of EV of a win rate, while playing mostly high stakes, mostly 1 KNL this regular played. Okay, in 2022. This graphic is actually public. You can find it in the internet if you search it sufficiently. And if you access data mine hand histories from all the different sites, we will see that these results are actually true. They are not fake, because the sites that sell hand histories, you will be able to see this guy having this result over those sites. Okay, so he played this strategy, made $500,000 while playing mostly high stakes and achieving an insane win rate that a lot of people think is impossible. And he did that playing exactly some very max exploit strategies. Okay, so here we have a description of a few of the things that this guy did within the sample. We can see here, for example, super high aggression frequencies. Take a look at that aggression frequency on the flop, 50%. And then he followed that with 47% aggression frequency on the turn. That's really insane, probably the highest I've ever seen. And you see what that produced in the bottom, 55 one sold flop with 28 1x showdown and 44 1x showdown. Then you see his raising frequencies very similar to that previous guy. He was just raising extremely aggressive, particularly on the flop, but also in further streets, with 29% raise IP on the flop in small pots, 22% raise OP in small pots. It's probably small, you guys can't see, but this pop-up contains the ideal intervals you should have for these stats, considering what is good theoretically and where you can potentially get with a highly exploitative strategy. So you see that sometimes he completely passed the upper end of the intervals that we at Metagame would consider pretty decent for exploiting population. So extremely aggressive stats across the board, with one difference, that compared to that guy who was mostly overcalling rivers, this guy significantly overfolding rivers. Here, I think certainly a function of him getting to the river with a very weak range, but nonetheless, it is a substantial difference between the two strategies. This guy just folding a lot on rivers. Then when it came to flop c-bets, floats, and raises, extremely aggressive strategies. So he was over c-betting the flop in pretty much all spots, over check raising against c-bet, and pretty much just playing extremely aggressive on the flop with c-bets, stabs, and raises. Just basically hyper aggressive strategy on the flop. With delay c-bets, extreme extreme aggression with the lazy bets, which is definitely something I recommend myself. But we can see here 79% the lazy bet, small blind versus big blind, 50% the lazy bet in position in PFR, 84% the lazy bet in three bet pot out of position, and then 53% probe as the caller, which is also extremely high, much above solver level. So this guy obviously also playing extremely aggressive with the lazy bets and probes, and with double barrels. Like double barrel is not a node that I recommend approaching from a max exploit perspective, but this guy didn't care. You can see his double barrel frequency, 75% double barrel into that pots of the position. Out of all of the stats that he played, I thought this one was the most insane because just basically barreling any two cards through that pots. 75% double barrel after C betting like 84% of the flop. Basically double barreling almost any two cards. The same in single raised pots, 77% double barrel. And he did all that in mostly known pools, so pools with screen names. So that's pretty sick. So hopefully with these two examples, you guys can realize that the biggest difference between who can succeed with max exploit strategies and who perhaps will not succeed with max exploit strategies is about the process for execution and exactly what is the plan that you have. Okay, so when playing max exploit strategies, one thing you should absolutely have in your mind is, can you execute it properly? And you have to be honest with yourself because, as we said, it doesn't take much for you to get countered for significant amounts of money. So if to begin with, you're not executing it correctly, then you might play a strategy that you think is supposed to perform, and then you don't see the results, and then you blame the strategy for it. It's extremely important you have the self-awareness of thinking, man, can I execute this properly? Have I studied this enough? Do I understand where the incentives come from? Do I realize where my edge is coming from when I play this type of strategy? When is it that I should stop? When is it that I should perhaps continue? Do you have a plan for when you get countered? This is extremely important. So what do you do when people show resistance? And can you assess the risk that you're putting yourself in all those different situations? Because this could be the difference between, having a graph like this that we saw for this guy to a graph where, you're barely winning or maybe you're even slightly losing because you think you're supposed to make all this money exploiting people, but you are the one actually getting exploited, right? So this needs to be let's say, an individual process of figuring out how comfortable you are with this level of aggression, right? So if perhaps there is something in these questions, in the answer to these questions, that perhaps you don't feel necessarily comfortable, perhaps you don't feel yet that you can, in fact, execute all of those things properly. Perhaps maybe you feel like it's too risky or that you cannot handle the risk that it involves, or that perhaps you don't have necessarily a great plan for what to do when you get countered, which hopefully by the end of this mentorship we will have, because that's the topic of next week. But if for any reason you don't feel necessarily confident to apply max exploit strategies, then the way to go is with minimally exploitative strategies. Okay, so minimally exploitative strategies come to serve as a middle ground between the dichotomy GTO and max exploit, right? And this is something that I wanted to bring not only in this mentorship, but I try to bring this idea in the Program Made Simple week, because I feel like a lot of times when people talk about exploitative strategies, it seems like there's this significant, it almost feels like a political party discussion where there's left and right, and then there's the GTO adopters and the exploitative strategy adopters, and it feels like these things, they are fighting against each other, and people on this side, they don't want to talk with people on that side, and vice versa, where as if there were only these two options. But it's not true. It's not true that there's only those two options, where in one side you're playing like super balanced and randomizing every play, and on the other side you're just being hyper aggressive in all spots in the entire game tree. Those are not the only options we have. We have actually many things in between. So that's what we're going to talk about today, minimally exploitative strategies. First, let me see what Matthias said. Would it be correct to say Phil Ivey was really good at this? You barely see him making big blunders. But sometimes he used to go for sick max exploits, but he was not going nuts every hand, and they often worked a lot. Yeah, I would say Phil Ivey is probably one of the people that have had the best strategical intuition of all time, right? To really understand on a fundamental level, almost on empathic. I'm not sure the word for it, but like he could see the game through the eyes of other people, or that's the way I perceive his expertise to be like, where he can perceive the game through the eyes of other people and exploit the shit out of them because he has this very crazy good intuition about how people play their ranges. So for sure, I would say he would categorize as that. So minimally exploitative strategies. One of the things that we're gonna want to do with minimally exploitative strategies to counter the fact that max exploit strategies offer a lot of risk is that we're gonna try and remain undetected. Because the problem arises when we get detected, right? As long as people are not figuring out what we're doing, we're good. We're making this money, we're exploiting people, and it's all good. But then if eventually people catch up to what we're doing, and sometimes they are better at us at the adjustment game in a certain context, in a certain circumstance, then it might be that we're just losing money against them. But then if we can stay undetected in a situation where we are exploiting people, so we are extracting more EV than GTO from their strategy, but they don't realize, then that's a very good thing. And the idea why that's a very good thing, because when we think about how much money we can make exploiting, a very important component of that is the time you can spend exploiting, right? Because, well, maybe you could say that, I should just apply max exploit strategies because they make the most money in a vacuum. That's absolutely true. However, what if that only lasts for a few weeks or a few months? You can only make a limited amount of money in a few weeks and a few months, right? But then if you can perhaps maybe make a little bit less money per exploit, but you can maximize the time you spend using that exploit, then you're going to be making lots and lots of money. One example of that is, actually the small c-bet example is something meaningful, because even though people still have a little bit of a leak there, defending versus small c-bets, small flop c-bets, let's say big blind versus button facing a small c-bet, used to be the case, let's say 4 years ago, more or less, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was a massive underraise actually against small flop c-bets. Massive underraise and massive overfold. I remember like the first time I studied it, it was like probably something like 5% underraise and then like 10% overfold. Nowadays, it doesn't have any underraise for regulars, and it's like 3% overfolded. So because people started using the flop small c-bet so much, then eventually the pool overall became better, adjusted to that, and now most people play very well against the small flop size. So it's a dynamic of the incentives and how aggressive you're pushing that exploit. So small flop c-bets eventually in the community became so popular that people were forced to get better at that node. And now we can't make all that much money anymore with small flop c-bets because people have gotten better with that strategy. Of course, there's a natural movement of any market to evolve and to get better. So even if no one was playing some highly exploitative strategies, people would eventually get better. That's just how things are supposed to work. But sometimes you can accelerate that process if you keep pressing that button too often, right? And I think that's what happened for a few nodes of the game tree, particularly that flop node. So the idea here is that if we can remain undetected, we can perhaps then maximize the time we can spend exploiting other people. And this might, I don't know if we can calculate that, but it might translate into even more money in the long run because we're just sustaining that exploit for a longer time. So before talking about exactly how to do it, I'm going to talk about when to use them, because I think it's important that you guys have this clarity, or this reference at least, for when to use minimally exploitative strategies. Okay, so the first thing I always talk about is, in nodes that population leaks are not huge. And the problem where the problem with nodes of the game tree where the leaks are not huge is that you can think of them as fragile exploit zones. Because remember that when we see the data, we have an aggregate of the whole pool, right? So you see, oh, people are overfolding 4% of the time here to triple barrel in this line. Okay, 4%. Considering blocker effects, you may not even have that 4% overfold with all the hands in your range. But let's talk about 4%. So 4% is the average. And then if that's the average, perhaps you're going to find a lot of people in the pools that you play that behave a little bit better than the average. And therefore, against this guy who is a little bit better than the average, that league doesn't exist anymore because you're assuming that he plays a little bit better and then he defends a little bit better with his ranges. And it might be that against this portion of the pool, then that league doesn't even exist. And you're there trying to exploit something that might not even be the case for that particular player. So in these zones where the deviation is small, then it's probably not the greatest idea to approach it from a max exploit perspective. Probably going min exploit instead is the way to go. You just tone down the aggression, you make a smaller deviation, smaller adjustment, because it might be that that deviation, that leak is not going to be present in a lot of people in your pools. Then you have high frequency nodes that converge quickly on stats. We're going to talk about stats in a minute. Okay, so one of the ways that people can find out about how you're playing is through your stats. So if you just keep playing just like this guy, right? And I remember seeing this in my HUD. If you just keep playing like this guy where you're just raising 40% of the time against C-bets, well, that's going to show up super quickly on any HUD stat, right? Any normal rag that has a typical HUD stat in their HUD of flop C-betting or flop stabbing or flop defense for C-bet is going to show up real quick. So perhaps in nodes that are super frequent, it may not be in your best interest to approach from a max exploit perspective because it's going to show up on your stats very, very quickly. Then we have the unique circumstance of playing very small pools with HUDs. That's the case of high stakes in a few sites, although it seems that sites might be transitioning into a no HUD policy in the future. I think that's probably what's going to happen in the future. Sites are going to transition to a no HUD policy in the long run to protect the recreational players. But if you are playing a very small pool with HUDs, then perhaps minimally exploitative strategies are also a better alternative. And to encompass all of the other situations, you should use it whenever you don't feel particularly confident about a max exploit approach. And when I say confident, it's not even about confidence in the numbers or confidence in the model that you built, because sometimes you might have complete confidence on the numbers. You see the numbers make sense in your face, but you still don't feel confident enough to execute them at the tables. And this is an actual subjective experience. If the subjective experience is not good, even if the numbers are true, then that can be detrimental to your performance. So whenever you're not feeling confident about max exploit approach, either you're not confident in the actual strategies or you're not confident in the execution and how they perform or how you feel about them, then you should probably go with the minimally exploitative approach instead. All right. In your opinion, what are the differences between low, mid, high stakes players about counter when they detect max exploit? I mean, for a small with HUD. Not much difference. Of course, when you play low stakes pools, the pool is just much bigger, right? Which means that people are not going to notice to begin with. But if we were to compare small pools in all of those different stakes, then I would say not much difference. What I have experienced throughout my life playing exploitative strategies is that regulars are good at clicking the call button on the river when they feel someone is over bluffing. That's for sure something that regulars are capable of doing. They have a perception of someone over bluffing, and all they got to do is click the call button. So they do that. But the thing is that this is not even close to the max exploit counter that they should apply against many very aggressive strategies. So they should be starting to slow play on early streets, for example. They should start raising bluffs depending on the specific situation. But what I've seen from experience that most people, the way they adjust is by clicking the call button more often. But all the other stuff, like raising more bluff catching more on early streets. So like be more sticky on early streets, be more sticky on flops and turns, and then raise bluffing, and then slow playing the top of the range. That's not something you typically see. It's just more about the way people play rivers and river calling ranges. All right, so let's talk about what are the ways. We're concerned that sometimes if we play max exploit strategies, people are going to realize what we're doing and they're going to counter us. So the most obvious thing we need to think about is, how is it that people can gain information about our strategy? You guys giving me ideas. How is it that other people can get insights into how we're constructing our ranges and how we're playing our strategy, how we're building our own strategy? How does that happen in practice? And while you guys talk about this, I need to find lost my conditioning controller mode here. Showdowns said Alex. Showdowns plus data mining from reliable stat sample HUDs or not hand or out of line showdowns, range compositions in hand to note. It's not allowed to access range compositions in hand to note while playing. It's not even possible. But yes, you could, of course, do it off the tables for sure. But as in a HUD, for example, if you use hand to note as a HUD and you hover over a stat, it's not going to show you the range composition. But yeah, that's exactly right. So there are two ways from which people can gain information about your strategy: through your stats and through your showdowns. That's how people gain information about how you're playing. So they're going to gain information about your frequencies through the stats in a HUD, and they're going to gain information about your range composition through your showdowns, the hands that they actually see how you played. So those are the two ways. And well, the objective then of a minimally exploitative strategy will be to, of course, give less evidence. We don't want people to know that we're exploiting them. We want to remain undetected. And we already established that the ways they can detect our strategy is through stats and showdowns. So what we're going to do, we're going to exploit in ways that control our frequencies. So we're not going to get completely out of line. We're going to have some process for controlling our frequencies, even though we are exploiting. And then we're also going to control our showdowns. What is the amount of information we're revealing on showdowns? Okay, that's it. That's what we need to do. Cool. Let's talk about the first thing: how to exploit in ways that control our frequencies. That's something that I use myself in quite a lot of different scenarios. And I'm going to show you guys here how to do it for yourselves. And here, there are a few things that are immediately obvious when we think about frequencies and stats. And I think if you use this process, you guys are going to see how easy it is to remain undetected. Okay? Well, first thing that we already established is that our frequencies are seen through HUD stats, right? So, of course, there can be some intuitive sense of statistics. So maybe like you play 5 hands in a row against a guy, and in 4 of those 5 hands, you showed up with the bluff. The guy doesn't even need to see a HUD to have an idea that you might be over bluffing, right? But typically, your frequencies are seen through HUD stats. And when you think about HUD stats, there are certain stats that are going to converge more quickly, because there is a constraint when it comes to HUD stats, which is that even if you play against the same player, if you're playing the same pool as that player and you play against each other very often, it's not like you're going to play, against that particular player all the time. There's plenty of other people in the pool, and you might not face each other at the same table, even though you play at the same pool. This can happen not even in zone tables, but also in regular tables, where let's say you open GG lobby and there's like 20 different tables and you play only 4 or 5. You might not even be in the same table as that other regular, even if you're playing at the same time every day. So there is this restriction, is that people are not going to have immediate loads of data on you very quickly. They're going to have to play hands against you, and there are going to be some stats that are going to converge more quickly, of course, particularly those ones that happen more often. And if you think deeper about HUDs, you always have a sense that there are certain HUD stats that are going to appear more often in a HUD than other HUD stats. For example, a very typical HUD stat that everyone puts in their HUDs is, what is my opponent flop c-bet frequency? But then I would put my money on into the assumption that a flop stab in 3-bet pots is a stat that is much less present in HUDs, just because of the availability of it and the relevance of it. So there are certain stats that are going to be present in HUDs more often. So the conclusion here is that we should be prioritizing controlling the frequencies of exactly those stats. Stats that are going to converge more quickly, and stats that are going to be likely very present in our opponent's HUDs. Maybe a stat converges quickly, but people don't even care about looking at that stat. So perhaps we should not be prioritizing controlling for that frequency in particular. Okay, so examples of these stats are pre-flop 3-bet. That's a very common one that everyone has in their HUD. Flop c-bet frequency, everyone has this in their HUD. Flop fold versus c-bet, I would imagine as well, it's something that is present in almost every single HUD. And then flop raise versus c-bet. You see that this is typically early street stats. Of course, people are going to have different stats in their HUDs, but then when you combine for the stats that are likely to be present in their HUDs with the conversion rate, so how much sample those stats need to have any significance, then you see that we're typically concerned mostly with early street stats. Those are going to be the most relevant as to not reveal too much information to our opponents through our HUD, through our stats. Okay, so that's what we're going to be controlling for. And then we're going to develop a few strategies to control those frequencies while still exploiting our opponents. Okay, because remember that we still want to exploit. It's just that we want to do it in a safer way that allows us to remain undetected, or at least to remain undetected for longer time. Maybe it's impossible to remain undetected forever, but we want to maximize that time length. So what are these strategies? I recommend 3 different strategies here. I use all of them myself. I recommend all of them. But of course, there are certain scenarios that maybe one is better than the other. And perhaps for one particular person and their level, their skill level, one might be preferred over the other. Okay, but those are the 3 strategies that you can use to control your frequencies while exploiting. The first thing is keeping the early streets intact. We're going to see how that's very easy. The second way is to do partial frequency adjustments. And the third way is to mix the pseudo GTO approach, or the low exploitability approach, like we covered in the first week, with the max exploit approach. And you can do it with a randomizer. Okay, let's talk about the first way, which is keep early streets intact. Well, it's very simple and easy, right? What I'm going to do is, well, I'm not going to change my strategy in these early street nodes. Quite easy, quite obvious. So if we're concerned that we're going to reveal information in these early street nodes with our stats, then the first thing we can do is, well, not adjust there at all. Or just keep that intact, keep that with a relatively balanced execution. Okay? Here, what you're going to achieve with this is you're going to significantly reduce the evidence you're giving and the exploitability of your adjustment. We talked about that in I think in the second week or the third week, where you could play a max exploit, but then you could play a min exploit where you keep the early street strategy intact. Well, with that, you significantly reduce the risk of your strategy. You significantly reduce the amount of money you can lose by getting countered when you keep the early street intact, because it's the early street that is going to make your strategy the most exploitable. So, and also you reduce significantly the reward, as we're going to see now. We saw that example I already showed in the beginning. So someone is overfolding on the river to the triple barrel. What you're going to do is you're going to, of course, start over bluffing on the river. But then you're also going to, if you want to maximally exploit that leak, you're going to start bluffing more on the turn, and you're going to start exploiting more on the flop. That's what we saw with this max exploit strategy adjustment. So we go from 60% bet on the turn to 94% bet on the turn. And then that's not all, because this is also bringing EV to the flop strategy. So you're also going to be increasing your flop c-bet frequency. So you see how the max exploit strategy to someone overfolding on the river is to range c-bet flop and then range c-bet turn and then over bluff rivers. And then we can see that by doing that, if of course we assume all things remain that way and our opponent does not adjust, we gain 15% boost in our overall EV. Okay. The mean exploit strategy approach would be, man, perhaps I'm not going to change. I'm not going to change the flop. I'm not even going to change the turn. I'm only going to overbluff with the hands that I get the river with from a balanced execution on prior streets. Well, this is obviously going to make you much less exploitable because now you're just playing balanced on flop and turn. But the problem with this is that the EV gain you're going to get is much, much lower. I calculated this for this particular spot. And if you account for the river overfold, but you keep the early streets locked, meaning you're not allowed to adjust flop and turn, only the river, then you get a super tiny 1.66% boost in your EV, the EV of your overall strategy. Okay. So that's the only problem with this approach, which is, yeah, it's super safe, super easy, super safe. You just start randomizing your strategy on the flop. And that way it's not going to show up in your stats. And of course, you're not going to be making yourself super exploitable. The only problem is that you're just not capturing that EV. You're just making a little bit more, right? You're making a little bit more money, which might be okay if what you want to prioritize is the safety of your execution. Now, second way we can do things is with a partial frequency adjustment. Okay, so the idea here is that we're going to take the frequencies from the GTO execution and we're going to adjust that partially instead of going all the way. Okay. And this is a middle ground between reducing risk and reducing reward, because your stats will change by doing this because you are in fact adjusting your strategy by some amount, but it's not going to be by this ridiculous amount if you were playing max exploit. And then the reward is also going to be lower relative to max exploit, but it's not going to be so much lower as the previous option, which was to just keep flop and turn intact. And the only problem is that this is harder to execute, right? So, for example, we could have the situation here where it is GTO to have this c-bet range construction. The max exploit is just c-bet range. So in one way, you have 53% c-bet frequency. The max exploit is to go all the way and bet entire range. Well, perhaps you could do something in the middle, right? Perhaps you could maybe c-bet 65%, 70%, 75%. Then all that matters is that you pick a level that you feel comfortable with and you're comfortable with the risk-reward ratio. So the closer you get to the max exploit approach, the more you're increasing a reward, right? The reward of playing exploitably is going to increase because you're capturing more EV. But then, of course, your risk is also increasing. You're making yourself more and more and more and more exploitable. So the idea is you're going to pick something in between here. And there are ways you can do this. Of course, there are multiple ways you can partially adjust your frequencies. You can be very creative with this. I'm going to show you here a few examples, but there are plenty of ways you can be deciding on how to adjust partially your frequencies. So we saw the example of the delay c-bet node, small blind versus big blind, in our previous class. We saw that this is the GTO strategy, 36% checks, a bunch of blocking bets, some 2/3 bets, and very infrequent overbets. And then we saw what is the max exploit counter against someone massively overfolding versus the lazy bet, as people are in this node. And we saw that the max exploit approach is to check your top pair plus and bet everything else. That's how you maximize EV here. And this is not even accounting for the fact that people will overfold rivers after they call the turn, and that they will overbluff rivers after they bet the turn you call. So the EVs here would be even further apart if we accounted for those river deviations as well. But this is the max exploit approach, and no one needs to do any calculations to quickly see how this is crazily exploitable, right? You're just checking all of your strong hands and then you're betting all of your bad hands. This is extremely exploitable. But this is the strategy that makes the most money against that leak our opponents are going to have. But then you can pick something in between here, right? If we take a look at the GTO model and we filter, for example, king high hands, we see that king high hands are played as a mixed strategy, almost all of the combos. And on the aggregate of this hand class, this is something you can do as well. You can bucket hand classes and you can treat hand classes, hands of the same hand class as the same to simplify your strategy. So king high here in GTO land is checking 33% of the time. You could say, man, I'm not going to go down to 0% check because that's going to be making me more exploitable. It's going to show up in my stats. I'm not sure if I would be able to handle this. Maybe people are going to notice. You have some concern about this. Well, you don't need to go all the way to 0. You can perhaps adjust it a little bit. So you go down to maybe 15% checks with king highs, right? So you're just basically going to pick a in-between level of the incentive you have. The incentive you have is to always bet with an air hand, but you're just going to be like, okay, I'm not going to do it all the time. I'm just going to do it sometimes just so that I can remain undetected. Okay, so this is typically what you would do with different hand classes in your range in different spots where you want to perhaps modulate your level of aggression. The only thing about this is that, as I said here in the bottom, this is harder to execute in practice because it requires that you have a good idea of the frequencies of different hand classes, right? So you're going to be there in the spot and you're going to be like, okay, I'm going to adjust the level of aggression with my ace highs here. But if you don't even know what's the baseline level of aggression with ace highs, how can you correctly make an adjustment? How can you shift your aggression one way or the other if you don't even have an idea of the baseline? And that's what max exploit strategies don't require, right? Max exploit strategies don't require you to know much because usually the incentive is so high that you're just going to be shifting all the way. So to adjust partially, you're going to have an idea of the baseline. That's why I always come back to this and how it is important to know theory to be a good exploitative player. That's what I told you guys in the first week. And I don't think I'm ever going to change my mind about this. To be a good exploitative player, to be an excellent, because to be a good, maybe not all necessary, but to be an excellent exploitative player, theoretical knowledge is extremely important. Okay, so to do this process of adjusting partially your frequencies, you would have to have at least some good idea of the baseline strategies. It's not to say that you can't do it without, oh my God, do I have to know all of the GTO frequencies to do this correctly? Of course not. Of course not. Maybe even if you make a few mistakes and you don't play your strategy exactly as you intended to, because that's something that can happen. Maybe you intended to play this level of aggression and you ended up playing a different one because you don't know the frequencies correctly. Even if you do that, even if you make such mistakes, you might still be extracting money out of the population. But having some idea of the baseline is certainly good. Okay. And then another way of doing it, which is the one that I particularly like because it utilizes my own framework for low exploitability strategies, which I showed you guys in the first week, is to adjust the frequencies by going up or down 1 or 2 buckets. I love doing that because to me in particular, it feels very straightforward, right? So I'm already thinking in terms of buckets in my head when I'm executing low exploitability strategies, right? So I'm gonna be executing the flop from a balanced perspective in a lot of situations. And then once I get to the turn, because of my knowledge of GTO strategies, I already have a sense of how I want to play that spot from a balanced perspective. And then if I want to adjust my frequencies, what I personally do that I like is I just go up or down 1 or 2 buckets. If you go more than 2 buckets, essentially you are shifting to a pure strategy because 3 buckets is like 60% frequency. So a lot of hands are just going to be shifted all the way if you go 3 buckets. So what I do is I shift 1, 2 buckets up or down depending on the incentive that my hand has that the spot offers. Okay, so if I'm here in the lacy bet spot and I know that my king highs are going to be mixed strategies, I'm going to have a sense of what the bucket these types of hands belong in a low exploitability execution. Maybe it's 60% bucket depending on the run out. Typically, I'm going to go, there's a one step before that, which is considering the frequency of my whole range. So I'm always using that as a baseline for my strategy. So how aggressive my range plays here. That gives me a baseline for how aggressive I want to be. I want to play different parts of my range. So if my range, for example, here, oh my God, I'm delay C betting 70% of my range here. That already gives me a pretty significant, robust baseline for different hands in my range. Cool. So let's say I'm gonna bet king highs for a 60% bucket. Then I know if I want to be a little bit more aggressive, I'm going to shift it up to 80% bucket. That's easy enough. That allows me to be more aggressive than I would from a theoretical perspective, but not so much to the point that I'm going all the way, right? So this is what I like the most. And there's also this final way that you can do it, which I think is probably the hardest, but I guess it's also possible, where you're going to pick a threshold for hands that you want to shift. And you're only going to shift if, of course, the hand you're currently playing meets that threshold. So you're going to say, okay, in this spot here, I'm going to shift all the hands that are above 70% frequency to pure strategies. Then if your hand fits into that threshold, you go ahead and you shift it. The problem here is that you got to know whether your hand belongs into that threshold or not in the first place. And you got to pick a threshold that makes sense for you. Like, how can you know if shifting something that is 60% is like, what's the difference between shifting someone 60% or 55 or 50? So it's a little bit trickier, it's a little bit harder to do, a little bit harder to make sense of it, but it's totally viable as well if you do have the knowledge for it. You just pick a threshold, you shift the hands that exceed that threshold, and you're there, you're shifting hands, but not going all the way with your range. Okay. So there is one example here with the flop C betting in ace-X double Broadway boards. Ace-X double Broadway boards are boards that we should play big bet or check from an equilibrium perspective. And if we take a look at the MDA, which is actually something that surprised me when I saw, and this is how important it is to check your intuition against the data at all times. Because before we check the data, I thought that this was getting overcalled. I was like, man, it seems like people are calling too much with these second pairs, because if you bombo on an ace king 5 type board, then king X can already fold quite a lot of the time. And I was like, I don't feel like people are folding so much with these hands. But I looked at the data and it was getting overfolded. So it's always important to check our intuition against the data. And then let's say I'm playing this hand class here, which is very typical, gut shot. I'm playing a gut shot here, and well, the optimal bucket on average for this hand class is the 60% bucket. So on average, I should put a gut shot into the 60% bet, 40% check bucket. If I want to be a little bit more aggressive because I think people overfold, then I can just go up one bucket and I bet those hands 80% of the time, right? So that's the typical way you would adjust your frequencies partially. So that's a middle ground between going all the way and keeping the flop strategy intact. What about play textures? What about play with textures for flop frequencies? For instance, small blind versus button red pot, we play check range for lower than 25% GTO bet frequency flops. Ace low low, monotone low connected. So we keep reasonable or perceived overall c-bet frequency thanks to those low c-bet frequency boards. Yeah, I think that it can work as a kind of a balancing act, right? So your aggregate frequency is not going to be changing too much because some boards you're checking more, other boards are betting more. Yeah, so that definitely can work. I don't know if, because like you would have to account for all boards and think of your strategy as a whole to see if you're getting to out of line or not. Like I wouldn't be able to say like from my head that such process would in fact lead to a reasonable flop spare frequency. I wouldn't be able to say for sure. Would have to do some math and calculations to know for sure. But yeah, like if you are with some parts of your range or with in certain boards, your frequency goes down, other boards your frequency goes up, then in the aggregate, it may be that your frequency is not going to be changing too much. So it could be that way for sure. Just that it's hard to say like out of your own mind, but it could happen. And the third way of doing this, as I said, I use all three. I recommend the three of them, depending on your skill level and your level of comfortableness with each. The third way is to, again, you're going to be adjusting your frequencies partially instead of going all the way. It's just that you're going to be doing it from a different method. And the idea here is that this is an easier way to execute a partial adjustment relative to the previous example where you have to think about the buckets for your hand. You have to perhaps think about the frequency for your hand class. The second way that we just talked about before, it requires more knowledge, or it requires that you use more mental energy to execute. This one here, as long as you know what the max exploit strategy is just much easier, because all you got to do is you run the RNG for what the type of strategy you want to play, and then you play the max exploit strategy with that frequency. And typically the beauty of max exploit strategies is that they're much easier to execute than anything else. Because of the incentives that people give us, you just know for sure what is the way to play a given hand. A bluff catcher, you just check, hold down. A bluff, you just bluff two streets. A super nutted value hand, you just slow play and then check raise. So typically max exploit strategies, they make it really obvious the way to play our hands. So if you want to adjust partially instead of going all the way, and a very easy way to do it is to just roll the RNG for how often you want to play the max exploit strategy. That's the beauty of the modern times we live in. You can just roll up a number on your screen and you can play a mixed strategy of strategies. Well, you don't have to play all the time GTO in that node. You don't have to play all the time max exploit in that node. You can play max exploit sometimes. So you just roll up the RNG. So let's say you are in a probe line, and it's a low board, it's a probe line, big blind versus button, and you're like, man, I don't know. He could have 4x in his range. Typically, paired boards are decent for the IP because high cards have a lot of value in paired boards. Going to have a lot of ace highs. So I'm not sure I want to go max exploit here. I don't know if I want to just bet randomly 10-9 of clubs all the time here. Perhaps I want to be a little bit more, cautious with my approach. And I'm going to play a minimal exploitive strategy where I'm going to roll 30% of max exploit here. So 30% of the time, I'm just going to bet any two cards. 70% of the time, I'm going to play GTO. That's an easy way to do it. You're just adjusting partially, but you just don't have to use all of the mental energy you would use for the previous options. Okay, so you just roll and you execute according to the RNG. Of course, this process, depending on the specific line, it might be that it's not necessarily applicable, because it may be that you do not want to play max exploit not even 30% of the time, because the max exploit will reveal a little bit on showdowns, right? As I said, it could be that you have, I don't know, king, queen of clubs here. King, queen of clubs is likely a pure check in equilibrium. And then you're like, I don't want to shift pure strategies to not get to showdown with those pure strategy checks and give him information. If you play this roll of 30% max exploit, then you should be betting king, queen of clubs. But then perhaps it's a node that you do not ever want to get showdown with the pure strategy check. So then perhaps you shouldn't use this particular execution. But generally, it's going to be very useful for most purposes, and it's quite easy. As long as you know the max exploit, then just roll up the RNG and use it occasionally. This can also be very useful if you're just trying to get comfortable with it, right? Like, the max exploit strategies have value and you want to get better at executing them. You want to test the waters, but you just want to just go all the way and start betting any two cards and bluffing people off and raising people and calling down people with these marginal bluff catchers. Well, you just ease yourself into that process by rolling a little bit. Okay, I'm going to play 30% max exploit just to see what happens. And then the rest of the time, I'm going to keep my usual execution because I don't want to go all the way like so fast. That could be a process as well. So there are these three strategies for controlling your frequencies while exploiting. Either you keep the daily streaks intact. I like this very much. I typically like keeping at least the flop intact. I think it's a good idea, particularly if you're playing, again, known pools with HUDs. If you're playing like the super high frequency nodes like flop CBAT, I think it's typically a good idea to keep the flops intact. If you don't want to keep the flops intact because you think the risk is not so high, then you can do a partial frequency adjustment. You can do it with the bucket system. You can do it with the threshold system. You can do it in many ways. Or you can do it even a third way, where you just roll up the RNG and play the max exploit sometimes and the suited GTO approach other times. That's something that can even help with the confidence of doing it, because you know you're not doing it all the time. You know that you're being safe with it, and you're in control of how much risk you're putting yourself into. So that can be mentally it can give you a mental satisfaction to know that you're controlling the risk, right? And that leads to the second thing we need to control for when we're trying to remain undetected. That's our goal here. And we're trying to remain undetected by giving less evidence of our exploitations. We're going to control our showdowns. We're going to control the information we reveal on showdowns. Okay, that's typically going to be important. And the thing about showdowns, which I think is probably it's probably more relevant compared to stats in terms of giving people evidence of our strategy. I think showdowns are typically, you could assign a higher weight to them in terms of their potential of revealing information. The thing about showdowns is that they get stuck in people's memories more than random HUD numbers, right? So when you play a hand and you see this very unexpected showdown, everyone has had this experience here, I'm pretty sure. You play a spot and you see a showdown you did not expect in the particular player. That's going to trigger some emotions. And emotions are going to make that memory stick in your brain. Numbers, numbers are just numbers. You see a number on your screen, you execute something based on the numbers you're seeing. You don't particularly feel attached to that adjustment that you're making. But then you see someone making this play that you never expect, that's going to trigger some emotions. And the second element of it is that it gives complete information about that particular hand, right? So for one particular hand, at least, the guy knows exactly how you like to play that hand. So he knows that with that hand, you checked on that board against him in that situation. And then the problem of it is that people can use that information to infer a lot of what you're doing in unrelated nodes or maybe similar nodes. And that's the biggest problem about showdowns, because sometimes you give a showdown to someone and it's just one hand, but people are going to use that one hand evidence to adjust how they play against you in other spots. And a lot of times they're going to be doing it correctly. So the guy sees you getting out of line with the bluff in a completely unrelated spot. He starts calling you down in this other unique situation that, if you're playing this spot super aggressively and over bluffing, maybe it's a safe assumption to say you're also over bluffing here. So he starts over calling you there, even though he never saw evidence of that other spot. So people are going to be inferring a lot of extra information from those showdowns, and that's going to be a problem. So to control information from showdowns, the key is that you're going to try to avoid drawing attention by showing down unexpected, unusual hands. So the same way we thought about what are the stats that people are going to be paying attention to, what are the typical stats people keep in their HUDs, what are the stats that converge quicker, we can also use the same thought process to showdowns. What are the showdowns that will actually mean something to people? Well, it's going to be the showdowns that are unexpected, unusually played hands. Things that people are going to be like, I don't see that every day. And then the guy might tag you. Then the guy might take notes on you. He is going to take action because what he just saw is so unusual that he feels like that information is relevant. If it's just a standard showdown, it's something that he expects, then obviously he's not going to take any action because it's just a very mundane situation. But if it's something unexpected and unusual, he might take action. So, question for you guys. What are typical unexpected showdowns? What would be something that you see and are like, that's tricky, that's different. I need to take this into consideration here. What would be something you would categorize as unexpected showdown? Shifting pure strategy hand classes. Cool, but can you be more specific about what type of shifts you would be like, huh, that shit is different? Bluffs with no relevant blockers. Cool. Someone showing down a strong value hand on the river that should always bet. Nice. I like it. Random bullshit hand. The random bullshit hand is funny because uh, maybe some of you guys saw that video I posted on my YouTube a few weeks ago about the when GTO bots play like maniacs. And it's sometimes we see a hand that a guy plays and we're like, oh my god, this guy's so spewy. And then you take a look at the solver, it was just solver approved. So it can be tricky sometimes to figure out what is bullshit, what is not, because solver can get wild sometimes. Check back with air in condensed spot. Check back with air in condensed spot. You mean like spot where you have a lot of good hands? Is that it? Pre-flop 3 bets with thrash hands. That's also something that can be tricky because we take a look like GTO wizard, big blind versus button, solver 3 bets like jack 6 suited, like jack 3 suited sometimes. It can be tricky. Like a set, yeah, checking those super good hands are definitely unusual, let's say. Combos that are pure check, never bluffed in GTO. Yep, that makes sense. Turning a high equity hand like a pair into a bluff instead of check back. Yeah, that one, that's definitely very telling for sure. Example, BBB, I got called down by a regular from bottom of his range where it was a super obvious fold. Yeah, this can be absolutely telling. Like it's a spot where your perceived range is super strong and then the guy is just calling with a super weak hand. Definitely indicative of something. From our bias perspective of what we expect from villain, a huge bluff from a villain in tight formation or a give up on a river from a hyper aggro deck. Cool. Very good. It's based on what you know. What do you mean it's based on what you know? Condensed as in when we supposed to bluff with all misses, like call, go, check, bet with busted draw. Makes sense. Call wider than GTO on the river, for sure. Wide call downs can be very telling immediately, for sure. Showdown, they're exploiting a leak that you have, but you usually don't care because the pool doesn't exploit. Can you give an example, a concrete example of that? But yeah, it can definitely be surprising if you never expect people to attack a given spot, and then all of a sudden, yeah, a guy does attack, right? It can definitely be telling about that guy's specific tendencies. Very good. You guys are mostly talking about what I'm going to talk about here as well. A huge flop on deep play, 300 big blind or so with the connector, etc. A huge bluff. Okay, yeah, huge bluff deep. For example, you're surprised if bluff missed a flush draw even though it's solver approved. Oh yeah, absolutely. That's what I was talking about. Sometimes like we feel someone just spewed the hell out of a hand, and then we take a look at it and it's solver approved. So yeah, sometimes it can be due to our own ignorance that we are shocked by a given play. But I'm going to talk about examples here that are going to be very telling, and you guys are going to be able to relate to this. Okay, so what do I consider 3 very specific, unexpected showdowns that will raise your opponent's eyebrows when they see it? Okay, certainly there are more, but I chose these 3 here because I think these 3 are probably the most relevant ones. Okay, so the 3 types of unexpected showdowns that I think will cause your opponents to raise an eyebrow is first, showdown value bluff. Some people talked about this here. So turning a hand that obviously has showdown value and most people would check it, then the guy sees that you bluffed with it. That's going to be pretty telling. Second, also you guys talked about it, a very weak bluff catcher call against high aggression. As humans, because we are risk averse, we project that risk aversion into other people. And because of our knowledge of bluffing hands and also perceived ranges, we have an expectation of which hands people should fold against our aggression. And then we see someone calling with a super weak bluff catcher in a spot where we expected them to respect our aggression. That's going to be quite telling as well. We're likely to sometimes even overreact to these things and start adjusting significantly against people doing that. And then third is the complete air high aggression. Because of how we also play our own tendencies, typically humans in regs are in general not very good at bluffing with complete air, even though they should sometimes. They're going to project that into other people, correctly so, because they're also not going to be seeing many people bluffing with complete air and having significantly high aggression with complete air. When you see someone being extremely aggressive with complete air, that's going to be very telling as well. So I would say these three types of showdowns are going to be very unexpected, and they will cause your opponents to raise an eyebrow. And they, of course, might cause your opponent to start taking a deeper look into your own strategy, and he might start to face or to give you some resistance when playing against you. Okay, so if you want to play minimally exploitative strategies to the point that you remain undetected, it's probably a good idea that you control for these three types of showdowns. Okay, the first one, which is the showdown value bluff, we can refer back to that example that we modeled the bet check bet node in a king high board. And we see that, man, if you want to play maximally exploitative here, you should bluff with ace queen. Even though it has 33% equity, you make more money bluffing than you do checking. So if you want to maximize your EV, you should be turning this hand into a bluff for sure. But then every single player is going to expect you to just check back with ace queen. You know, you're beating all of those ace highs. Villain's going to have ace tens, ace jacks, ace eights in his range. So you have all of this equity in the check back line, and everyone is going to be expecting you to check back with a hand like this. And then if you all of a sudden you show up with the bluffing hand, and the bigger the size, the more it's going to be in your opponent's memories. If you overbet with a hand like this, then eventually someone is going to have a calling hand, even though people overfold. Eventually they're going to have a calling hand that they're going to call with because they're going to be calling sometimes. Then that might raise an eyebrow. And it might be like, oh my God, this motherfucker just turned ace queen to a bluff here. Like, he obviously knows that you know that this is a check in theory. So this is immediately something very telling. The second one is I gave two examples of the same. So here, this one is the same example where you're turning a hand that people expect you to check. So this is from one of my YouTube videos where I took this hand here and I turned into a bluff on the river by overbetting. This is a pocket eights hand in a jack high board. Yeah, the board got a little bit connected, but even then I would say I would expect most people to think that pocket eights is a check behind here, and they would expect me to play it as a check behind. So when the guy calls here and he sees, holy shit, solo turn pocket eights into a bluff here, that's really something. That's really something. What is it that he's doing here? So that's going to be relevant information. Or when you make a call like this on the river, like it's a 4-bet pot, and then it's a 4 to flush board, the river paired, and then you're bluff catching with a under pair with no relevant blocker. So everyone expects you to fold this, right? I'm pretty sure this guy expected me to fold pocket kings no heart here when he made this bluff. Luckily for me, it worked. He had pocket tens without a heart here, so I completely owned him. But he certainly expects me to fold this hand here. And then he sees that showdown, he's like, fucking shit, what is this dude doing here? Just basically doesn't have a folding range if he's calling this. So this is going to, for sure, cause him to make some questions at least about my strategy or your strategy. And sometimes if you're making like a super big bluff with no blockers, like 2x spot with a random air hand, then this might as well be a little bit telling because people don't usually see 2x spot bluffs with just super random any two cards. typically they're going to see some kind of blocker, right? I'm going to have a blocker to the straight here. I'm going to have, I don't know, something here that would justify making a huge bluff. But no, I'm just there bluffing king 3 offsuit for a 2x pot bluff, which is a hand that he probably doesn't even expect me to have in the first place, not only to bluff 2x pot with. So these things, they're going to reveal information to our opponents. And they could potentially use this information, and this is the bigger problem. They could use this evidence of their behavior in one spot, and they can extrapolate to other spots. This can actually be good for us in some circumstances, because given what we're going to talk about next week, we can anticipate how they're going to perceive our strategies and then apply that counter to the counter. That's something advanced we're going to talk about next week. So sometimes this is good for us, but other times it can be pretty bad because, we should be overbluffing those spots. So if the guy all of a sudden decides that we are overbluffing all spots just because he saw one hand, now we're missing all of those overbluffs that we could have had in these other different nodes because the guy saw this major deviation that we made, right? So this can be a problem, particularly against people that are adaptable and that are obviously competent, okay? So the solution here is quite straightforward. We're going to avoid giving people this evidence. We're going to avoid making big shifts. We're going to avoid making big shifts with obvious showdown value hands. We're going to avoid making big shifts with obvious bad bluff catchers. And we're going to avoid making obvious early street super aggressive bluffs, okay? Point 3 is interesting because it's part of GTO strategy, like bet lines, IP just tripling some very low equity hands. Should we still stay away from that? Cool. So you're talking about here that, well, man, what if my play is solver approved? Is that still revealing information? Well, unfortunately, yes. Because what matters a lot of the time is not necessarily what is solver approved, but how that is going to be perceived by our opponents. It's the perception that matters. So sometimes you might be playing the hand in like this super aggressive way, but that is actually solver approved. But then if that's something that no one does, if you're the only one that knows that particular solver trick, that you should be super aggressive in that line. But from that guy's perspective, he has never seen anyone do something like that. Then the perception that he's going to have of you is that you're a maniac, not that you're a robot, right? So sometimes it goes against us that sometimes we're playing aggressively, correctly, but because people are typically needy and their perception of us that we're going to be maniacs, that can be certainly a problem, even though we're just executing what we're supposed to. But the idea here is that we're going to avoid the big shifts, okay? So obvious showdown value hands that everyone expects you to check. Perhaps if you want to remain undetected, you're going to pass on that EV. It can be hard sometimes to resist that temptation because they're like, man, I made the model. I saw that if I bluff with ace queen here, I'm going to make like 3 big blinds per hand. That's insane. That's a lot of money. Should I really be letting it go? It's a decision you have to make. It's a decision you have to make, again, considering how much risk and reward you're willing to adopt. But what's the ratio you want of risk and reward? If you can tolerate more risk, maybe you should go for the max exploit. If you don't want your strategy to be capable of being exploited for more money, then maybe you should avoid it, or maybe you should go with min exploit. So what I'm saying here is that you should avoid it, but perhaps you don't want to stop doing 100% of the time. Maybe you're going to do it like 20% of the time. 20% of the time, I'm going to pull this bluff here. Maybe that the other, I'm just going to check as people expect me to check with this hand. So, you can be very creative with it. But the idea is that if you want to prioritize not getting detected, then this is what you're going to have to do. You're going to avoid obvious showdown value bluffs, avoid obvious bad bluff catcher call downs, and avoid obvious bad bluffs or like hyper aggressive bluffs in early streets. You might fold a lot in a line. You might fold a lot in line like check call, check bet because it's under bluffed, but then you see a showdown on the villain check call the flop. with a crazy hand to bluff on the river. Yeah, that can definitely be telling as well. All right, so this is the process for controlling the information you're revealing with both your stats and then your showdowns. Okay, this is how you would do it if you would then decide that you want to play minimally exploitative. But I get that you guys still gonna have a lot of doubts about this, right? When to go min, when to go max, when to go GTO, what should be my approach? Can I bluff any two cards here? Can I not? Can I raise the spot against regs? This is something that I completely get it. It's not necessarily trivial. It's not necessarily something that it's gonna wake up one day and figure out how exploitative you're gonna want to be in every single spot. This is something that takes a little bit more experience and time. And the problem with always having this confusion, should I go min, should I go max, should I go GTO, is that this is a cognitive dissonance. Okay, this is a cognitive dissonance, and here we can use Wikipedia definition to help us understand what this concept is. So the definition you can take from the internet is that a cognitive dissonance is the perception of contradictory information and the mental toll of it. And this is typically what you guys are going to feel. This is mostly about a feeling. It's a subjective experience when you're considering exploitative strategies. And how can I frame this cognitive dissonance? And I've had this experience myself. I have seen this in hundreds of students that I've had in my career, which is a very common cognitive dissonance of feeling like this. Man, I'm seeing this data. Like, I'm not stupid. It's obvious to me that this should be what makes the most money. I'm seeing this data, like this is facts. I cannot say anything against the facts that I'm seeing. So it should be that max exploit should make the most money. But at the same time, it feels too risky. And I've heard all these people in the past saying that if I start exploiting other people, I'm going to get countered and then I should play GTO. And everyone just talks about GTO. I don't see many people talking about exploitative strategies. Perhaps that's not the way to go, because if it was, then there would be more people doing it. But when I look around, I don't see many people doing it. So what is the truth here? Are they good or are they not? Should I do it? Should I not do it? Will I be getting exploited or will I not be getting exploited? I think that many of you might have had this feeling. Maybe you're having this feeling right now. It's completely normal, as we're going to talk about. The thing about highly exploitative strategies is that they are fucking uncomfortable, okay? Until you have, let's say, 1 or 2 years, I'd say at least 1 year of going hard on exploits. Until you have 1 year on your belt of going hard on exploits and going through downswings, but then eventually getting out of them, highly exploitative strategies will feel uncomfortable as fuck. Okay, they will feel uncomfortable. There's no alternative here. And there are many reasons for this. Well, the first thing is that you're risking much more money than you're used to. Now you're playing all these super highly exploitative strategies that no one ever told you they were good. Stuff like raising rivers and then triple barreling over bets because the data shows that people are just folding too much, and then calling down with fourth pair against recreationals, and sometimes getting stacked by them and feeling like you're the most stupid person on the table because you just called down away with fourth pair and he bluffed with the third pair. So you're risking much more money than you used to. You're exposing yourself to the judgment of others, and that can be a minor thing for some people. That can be a worse thing for other people. But the reality is that you are exposing yourself to judgment, because sometimes you're going to be showing up with these outrageous hands and making these plays that perhaps your peers, the people you talk poker with, they think it's stupid. Perhaps a lot of people that don't understand data, that don't study with it, they're going to be like, what are you doing? You're just spewing money. Like, what are you doing? That's not good strategy. What you're doing, you should play theoretically optimally here. So you are exposing yourself to the judgment of your peers, to the judgment of your opponents. And you guys are going to see this happening if you apply exploitative strategies correctly and you start making a lot of money. Regulars are going to start attacking you in the chat. They're going to start cursing you and saying, "No, well played, man. You're so dumb." And you're going to see that happening to you. It happened to me. It happened to many of my students. It happens to anyone that challenges the current beliefs about a certain topic, a certain ecosystem. And if you start going against what everyone is saying, you're going to face this judgment. And perhaps this makes it even more difficult for you to stick with your beliefs because people around you are making this pressure for you to give up on those beliefs. And of course, it's something new and it's something complex, which leads to uncertainty and insecurity. Okay, you don't fully grasp that. You have an idea, you're playing with models, you're trying out new things, but you don't still trust completely, right? You haven't played hundreds of thousands of hands and tried it out for yourself to see if it actually works. It's one thing hearing a guy saying it, and I understand that no matter how good I am at transmitting knowledge, which all modesty aside, I think I'm reasonably good at, you're still just hearing some guy talking about the numbers, some numbers on screen and the experience he has had in his life. But what really changes our perceptions is personal experience. We need to experience things from our own perspective, with our own eyes, with our own hands. And only then knowledge becomes tangible. It becomes something that is a part of you. It's only when you put in the work and you act upon it and you execute things and you see their results that they actually feel that they belong to you. So it's completely normal. That's next slide. It's completely normal if you feel that way. Okay. There's nothing more beautiful of getting that rant. Yeah. Do you recommend to reduce many of Mac's exploit lines in disastrous sessions when you already are losing 7 blind plus and you feel your mindset is degraded? Or at the opposite, use those sessions to improve your mind ability to deal with uncomfortable strategies? Ideally, you would never want to shift what you believe is correct just because you're feeling bad, right? This is the utopia we have to strive for. We have to strive for consistent and high level performance, regardless of how bad or sad or demotivated or frustrated we're feeling. But of course, it's not wise to think that way because we're not robots. We have emotions, and our emotions have a tremendous capacity to change our behavior. So I would say if that's something that really makes you frustrated to the point that your performance might deteriorate, then yeah, maybe reduce the value of your strategy, but prioritize reducing the variance. So if you sometimes you might want to reduce the variance as opposed to maximizing the profitability because the alternative is just playing much worse. So yeah, that can make sense. Ideally, you want to try and get better at that as much as you can and be able to pull out the same high level strategy regardless of how bad it has been working in the short term. But I know that we're not robots, so it might be that you want to do that. Okay, so if you're feeling like that, if you have had these problems of uncertainty, insecurity, the fear of judgment of others, and the fact that your variance is increasing, etc., you should know this is completely normal. I already told you guys my first experience with calling down a lot on rivers. Immediately, that was obviously not wise of me because I was overly confident. I was crushing 200L. I was studying those things. I saw all that extra edge I could generate, and then I immediately took a shot at 500L. I had never taken a shot at 500L. I immediately took a shot right as I was trying to implement new strategies, right? So that was not wise. And then I lost a bunch of money because I was implementing things incorrectly, but also because I ran bad. And then it took me a while to recover, which I eventually did. But it's probably not a great idea for you to just be reckless, right? You need to have a process for the implementation of these more aggressive strategies. So even though it is normal to feel this way and to have these cognitive dissonances, it is absolutely essential that we solve these cognitive dissonances, okay? You do not want to be playing under cognitive dissonance. This is, I think, one of the worst feelings you can have when you're playing is to not have certainty whether what you're doing is good or not. You're like, everything that you do, it feels like a confirmation to what you think is bad. So you make a bluff and then you get called, and then max exploit strategies are bad because I got called. And the next thing you do is you slow play and then you call down against the fish, and then it works. And then you're like, max exploit strategies are the best thing in the world. And then you're fluctuating emotionally and you just don't know what to believe. You don't know what is correct. So we have to solve cognitive dissonance. You do not want to play under cognitive dissonances. And to be honest, I have gone even to the point of suggesting to a student to stop playing exploitative strategies because his dissonance was too high. He understood from an intellectual perspective that exploitative strategies were good, but he struggled a lot with pulling the trigger, with following through with the strategies, and he would always second guess himself. And he had this very strong theoretical understanding, very strong, and I would say even kind of like rigid theoretical approach. And I was like, man, I understand that you want to learn more about exploitative strategies, and I can see that you're trying, but I can also see that you're putting yourself through a lot of emotional discomfort because some part of you does not want to believe, and then you basically never perform at your highest capacity. So we want to solve those cognitive dissonances one way or the other. I'm obviously here talking about exploitative strategies because I have a lot of facts that I showed you guys throughout this mentorship to say that this is going to make you more money. But then if you have those internal cognitive dissonances that make you just second guess yourself all the time, then perhaps you want to use a different approach. So I'm never going to be the one to say that there is an approach that fits everyone, because there isn't. There isn't one approach that is going to work for every single player because everyone has different skill level, different risk tolerance, different personalities, different curiosities. So it is important that you have the self-awareness and that you try to solve your own cognitive dissonances. Now, how do we solve cognitive dissonances? A cognitive dissonance is a conflicting of different beliefs and different perceptions that feel contradictory. And a lot of times they feel contradictory because we don't have a plan. We don't have clarity over what it is that we're doing. So when we don't have clarity of what it is that we're doing, this causes confusion. Confusion causes us to have biased perceptions. And then these biased perceptions are going to turn into conflicting beliefs. Okay, so what we need to solve cognitive dissonances is to develop a game plan. The game plan is exactly what it sounds like. It's a plan for the game. You're going to plan beforehand. That's the next slide. You're going to determine beforehand how is it that you want to approach different game scenarios. And you're going to do that because having predictability is going to make you feel more safe and is going to reduce confusion. Okay? And this is something that it amazes me how it's not something that it's commonly addressed in the topic of improving at poker. Of course, we study, right? We review hands, we drill, we do those things that make us improve. But it's almost never a process that gives us predictability over our own execution. We are improving our understanding of the game, but it doesn't give us necessarily predictability over execution at the tables. And this is extremely important because there's a pretty significant difference between what you know or what you think you know and what it is that you actually execute. Knowledge and execution are very different things. Usually execution is very much below your level of knowledge. And when it comes to studying, we're increasing our level of knowledge, but then not much is done to increase our level of execution. So execution is mainly what matters because it's when we execute that we're actually playing and making money, right? So when it comes to the cognitive dissonance of exploitative strategies, what you should try to answer from your game plan is, how exploitative do I want to be in this node, in this spot against this player type? Because that's going to be the most common cognitive dissonance you're going to have. Should I play max exploit here? Should I bluff any two cards here? Should I call down with this bluff cash against this player? Should I raise this hand in this flop against this player on this node? And then you're always in this process of, wasting time and energy figuring out how aggressive, how passive, if you should take into account dynamics, if you want to review information, if you don't. This can have a very significant toll on your mental state. So you want to figure that out off the tables beforehand. Before you sit to play, you need to have an idea of how you're going to approach different game spots, different game scenarios. Okay. And one thing that might not be the answer you're looking for is that there is no absolute answer to this. Okay. There is no absolute answer to what should be my game plan for this spot in this circumstance against this player. There's no absolute answer because each player is different and everyone has a different skill level. Everyone has a different level of confidence, and everyone has, most importantly, a different level of risk tolerance. I, for example, because I have played exploitative strategies for many years, I have a business that pays my bills by teaching people exploitative strategies, and I can see that these hundreds of people are making money because I can pay my bills, so they have to be making money, otherwise I wouldn't be able to pay my bills. So I don't have cognitive dissonances because I have the experience. But before, when I didn't have the experience, I had all those cognitive dissonances. When I was first starting out, in fact, my partner in my business, Metagame, he sometimes he mocks me because the first time he came to me to ask me to study together with him to build exploitative strategies through MDA, I actually told him, man, I don't want to study that shit because I think that's too simplistic. I told him that in 2016, I believe, because at the time I was like super solver oriented. I didn't want to hear anything other than solvers. So I was like, man, I don't want to hear about this thing that you're talking about, that people deviate in these ways, other ways. I'm going to play very theory oriented because I think I'm good at that. And I know that I'm going to make money doing that. So I told him that I didn't want to approach the game from that perspective because I thought it was no good. So we're always going to have these confusions, and it's mostly a personal question of where it is that you are with your level of skill, confidence, and risk tolerance to answer the question of how exploitative you want to be in all the nodes of the game tree. So I would love to give you guys one unique answer that fits all, but there is not. With that said, I know that you guys need and want a framework. You want and need a baseline, something from which you can build upon and perhaps adjust based on your own criteria. So that's why tomorrow in the complementary video, I'm going to describe to you guys my entire approach for the post-flop game tree of where I like to go GTO, where I like to go max exploit, where I like to go min exploit in all the different lines versus regulars and fish. Okay, I was already going to cover some of this in this video, but of course we wouldn't have time for it. And I understand that this is something that is going to give you guys So I know that this is something that will make you guys feel more capable of executing the strategies because, of course, we need predictability. We need to have a ground from which we can build. So tomorrow, complementary video will be exactly about that, an exploitative game plan that you guys can execute, which I think is very solid. But of course, I extremely recommend that you adjust this game plan based on your risk tolerance, your skill level, and your level of confidence. All right. Awesome. We have 6 more minutes until we finish, so we can then answer a few questions that you guys might have, because this is what we had for today. Tomorrow, we're going to have the complementary video. And on Thursday, we're going to have the plain explain session where I show you guys exactly how I approach this. So what are the nodes that I approach from a GTO perspective? What are the nodes that I approach from a minimally exploitative perspective? What are the nodes that I approach from a maximally exploitative perspective? I have a question. Is Mike? Yeah, you can use Mike, no problem.
Uh, Hello, you can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, kind of a long question, but it has to do with what like the entire session has been about.
Go ahead.
So I had this situation where it's kind of different because I'm actually like a streamer, right? So, I stream Twitch regularly, everything like that. So people can actually see my play.
Hmm.
So I had this situation where this was like a year or two ago where I was playing like
You muted.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Um
I don't know if it's just me, but I can't hear any longer. Yeah, it's cutting.
was it
It's cutting a lot. Okay. I'll get on to the other questions while you do it. Uh, do you adjust this framework between online and live play? Yeah, absolutely. I think for live play, you basically want to go much more exploitative than online, right? There's no HUDs live. Typically, you're playing much less hands, so people cannot, even if they wanted to, they cannot build samples on you. Live, you can mock your hand, right? That's crazy. Live, you don't have to show in a lot of situations. I guess some situations you're obligated to, but a lot of spots you can just get away with mocking your hand and not revealing anything on showdown. So live, I would approach it much more exploitative than online for sure. For sure. If I mix pseudo GTO with max exploit strategies using player types, not RNG, my frequencies will not reveal my Euro strategy because I play against different way. What do you think about this approach? Uh, I mean, there's only two player types, right? Regulars and fish, and we're typically only gonna have one fish per table, so we're like playing lots of times against regs, even though our money comes from the fish. So I'm not sure if it would be all that disguised, to be honest. But if somehow you can make sure that it is disguised, then I would say you're fine. Because ultimately what we're trying to control for is the frequencies. So if we are controlling for the frequencies that show up in the HUD throughout a specific way that you're doing there, then we are achieving the goal. The goal is to control the frequencies somehow. If you're achieving that somehow, then I think that's fine. That's definitely fine. I just want to play like the guy with the 9 BB win rate. But how does he avoid getting caught by others? His stats are so out of line. So, uh, the thing about highly exploited strategies is that, as I said in the beginning of this call, what regulars are good at doing, fishes are incapable of counter exploiting. Okay, so against fishes, you should always play max exploit, as I'm going to talk about in the next video. So a lot of those stats that he plays also come from the fact that he plays like that against fishes. But that aside, uh, we're typically, because of the spotlight effect, we completely overreact to how people might adjust to our strategy. So this guy is an example, but I could give maybe 4 or 5 people that have achieved very high win rates in non-pools, play extremely aggressively. I've never was the one to play max exploit in all nodes. I've always been a little bit more cautious. I've achieved good results nonetheless, but you can find more examples of this. The truth is that humans are not good at countering aggression. That's the truth. Humans are not good at countering aggression because, as I said, the way people counter aggression is if they feel like you're over bluffing, they're going to call on the river with a marginal bluff catcher. This is what people do. But for example, if someone starts raising you the shit when you see bet, the first thing you should do is you should only see bet value. But people are not competent enough to always be aware of who they're playing against to know that, oh, this is the guy that raised a lot against c-bets. I'm only going to bet value against him. They continue c-betting bad hands, and then they get raised, and then they are forced to fold. And then they don't realize that in order for them to maximally exploit a super aggressive guy like this, the adjustment is at all streets, not just at one street. So they have to completely reform their own strategy, which is not something that is easy to do on the fly. So the truth is that it is not easy to face aggression. If you take a look at Staffan, for example, which is a guy that a lot of people like to follow and watch his plays and see and study his play, if you study Staffan's stats, he does not play GTO. He actually plays very far from GTO, much more aggressive GTO in most notes. And yet, he's making supposedly a lot of money at high stakes in the toughest games in the world. And he even plays that style heads up against Linus or some other people. That guy is not playing GTO. He's playing very exploitatively, and he's making himself exploitable in a lot of different ways. But the truth is that it is not easy at all to counter aggression. It is not intuitive, and it's not something that people are prepared to do because it involves them risking a lot more money and getting completely out of line with their strategy, which is something that they're not used to do. So typically, this fear that we have of getting countered, I think it's an effect of the spotlight effect. I think certainly something very significant. There's a lot of also GTO mania in the community. Barry Sweet talks about this in 2+2. And he made a funny comment a few months ago where high stakes were playing these outrageous hands, and he typed something like on 2+2. I guess now this means that GTO mania is over. But the fact is that because GTO products make money, they sell this idea that you're going to be unexploitable, and regardless of what you do, you're going to be making money. Then there's all of these products about GTO, right? There are no products about exploitative strategies in the market, but there are all of these dozens of different GTO products because they sell the safety. And then the community has grown to believe that's the only way to go. But before GTO, before solvers came out, people were making millions playing extremely exploitative, right? So I think this is mostly an effect of our modern poker community that has been dominated by solvers and solver products. And it is the most profitable narrative for most of the content creators, for the software products, and it makes people feel unsafe. I think it's a combination of these two things. How has knowing Satabene influenced your study, especially about using and implementing max exploit strategy? It hasn't influenced too much because before the first time I studied with him, I already was studying. I was already using max exploit strategies. What I think he definitely influenced me and definitely helped me make me a better player is that he's probably one of the best guys I know of making adjustments. He's extremely good at adjustments. So understanding how you're perceiving him and then playing that counter to the counter, which is exactly what we're going to talk about in the next week. And there's a hand, I will never forget this hand. And this is how much I was influenced by this. I remember this was 2019 or 2020. I don't recall correctly. But I had a student was playing staked, and he was playing 200 Zoom. And Satabene was playing 200 Zoom as well every day. And they would fight against each other all the time. And there was a hand that my student played against Satabene. And my student plays, or in that particular hand, played a call down line with the marginal bluff catcher because we know the triple barrel is overbluffed, and then he just executed what we taught him. He just called down with the marginal bluff catcher. I think he called down like with third pair or something. And then Satabene played a line where he overbet the river with second pair medium kicker. He played like triple barrel, overbet river with second pair medium kicker, and then completely owned my student. And then my student sent me that hand history. And I was like, holy shit, what this guy did to me. So he's one of the best players I've ever seen with the capacity to adjust and to stay one step ahead, which is what we're going to talk about next week. In terms of max exploit strategies, I was already doing a lot of things that he was doing himself. So it was mostly that insight of the adjustment that I think he's definitely one of a kind in that regard. I used to do this, go absolute nuts if my RNG was on 100 on flop through turn and river, though turn and river also any way possible. And also 3-bet like a madman if RNG was on 100. I did this regardless of the hand almost, and I always thought, if they see my hand sometimes, that is great because they will over adapt. But now that you say that rags are not really good at adapting to the max exploit, maybe it is not a good way to go. Yeah, I'm not sure why you would do that. To just like 3-bet a2 card just because the RNG is at 100. Maybe like they're trying to fool people into thinking something that they shouldn't think. I don't know. Maybe it could work. Yeah, just to make an image. Yeah, I get it. I don't know. Never explored necessarily with building an image to then exploit that image. It's never something I did. So can't say much about it, but could work if you do it right. I can see it working. You could maybe build an image that you're a massive overbluffer, and then you just keep thin value betting rivers. If you can do that correctly, you can make tons of money. Because thin value betting is people that overcall can sometimes be more profitable than overbluffing is people that overfold. So it could work. All right. This is it then, guys. Hope you enjoyed the session. Tomorrow, we're going to have the complementary video with the exploited game plan I recommend for you guys. And then on Wednesday, we're going to have our interview and Q&A with Dan Gentleman Cates. Excited for that talk with him. It's definitely going to be a good time. And then on Thursday, we're going to have our Play and Explain demonstration and our live Q&A as usual on Friday. All right, folks. Thanks, and I see you on Wednesday. Bye-bye.